Hello, welcome to the Times and the Sunday Times newsroom. We're live with From Westminster to Your World. It's an online event with me, Chloe Tilley. You'll normally find me on Times Radio Breakfast, Friday to Sunday. I'm delighted to be here with you this evening. Let me introduce you to our guests who are with us for the next hour. Thank you so much for being here. First of all, we're joined by Gabriel Pogrund, Whitehall editor of the Sunday Times. Richard Fletcher is with us as well, business editor for the Times. Oliver Shah, associate editor for the Sunday Times, and also Rachel Sylvester, chair of the Times Education, Health and Crime Commissions. Thank you all so much for being here. Now, as we count down to the general election on July the 4th, we've got journalists from the Times and the Sunday Times breaking down the week's headlines, looking at all of the issues which are going to define this 2024 election. You know what they are. They're the economy, they are health, they are education, health, crime, environment. The list goes on. And whatever politicians say, and indeed do, then we're going to look at what it means for all of us, for you, for us as well. We've already got some of your audience questions. I'm really grateful to you for submitting those. But if you haven't already, don't worry. There is a Q&A box on your screen. Just click that, and throughout the course of the conversation, I will weave them into our discussion. Now, let's begin. Probably the best way to discuss, first of all, is to look at the campaign so far. Gabriel, what have you made of, it's quite an eventful 3 weeks.
It certainly has been. I think that in terms of Labour's story, I mean, their first fortnight was almost a microcosm of Keir Starmer's own leadership. He spent the first phase of it talking to his party, being subsumed by the bits of Labour criminology that most people don't know or care about, all these acronyms, the NEC, the National Executive Committee, would Diane Abbott be selected or not? That is all in the rearview mirror now, just as Keir Starmer kind of condemned that to his past when reforming the party's rules back in 2021. He has been desperately focusing on the country over the last 2 weeks, and he's been ably assisted by Rishi Sunak. I was speaking to somebody in Tory HQ today, and I asked them for their reflections on the campaign. It's difficult to theorise or offer anything too sort of systematic or profound about the gaffes. But I said, what is your big misjudgment so far? And their answer was very, it was immediate, and it was pretty candid. They said that they just completely underpriced the prospect of Nigel Farage coming back. They spent the first 2 weeks trying to pulverise the Reform UK vote, all this bogus degrees, national service, triple lock plus on pensions. They thought they had dealt with that, and they had Richard Tice dead and buried, and Farage has emerged. And the difficulty for them is we all kind of expected the Labour juggernaut to roll on, but now their vote is just being squeezed so severely by Reform and the singular personality that is Farage that it is very difficult to see where they go.
Richard?
I think it started quite slowly, and I think for a while it looked like Ed Davies' stunts were going to be the most interesting, most interesting part of the campaign. But it has obviously really hotted up. Obviously D-Day. And Farage, you mentioned, and I think actually the best way to sum that up is that old expression, which is simply that you couldn't have made it up.
Farage has been the only point of real excitement to my mind, hasn't it? I mean, other than that, you've got the lack of jeopardy, to borrow a word from Gabriel before we came on. You've got a huge poll lead for Labour. Very few people think the Tories have a chance of forming an outright majority, forming a government. So you have a fairly low momentum, low energy Tory campaign, a Labour Party determined not to make too many mistakes, and that leads to a contest that doesn't have a huge amount of fireworks in it, barring the Farage intervention.
What's fascinating to me is that Tories started off saying there was a steep and narrow route to victory, but then they've been chucking rocks at themselves. Farage has been chucking rocks. It's like a sort of assault course plus the steep and narrow path to victory. And now we've ended up with a situation really where the Conservatives now pretty much seem to have written off winning, and they're talking about this threat of the supermajority and don't give Keir a blank cheque. So it's a complete shift even within 3 weeks, and it's really interesting to watch that the collapse has been so dramatic, the rocks have been so numerous, the slippery slope so treacherous for Rishi Sunak, that now it's all about you know, how can he just reduce Keir Starmer's enormous majority?
Well, let's pick up on that, because Grant Shapps was on Times Radio Breakfast this morning and said we've got to be careful of a supermajority for Labour, which in itself, I mean, Gabriel, that just seems astonishing that we're only halfway through this election campaign. There's 3 weeks to go. You've got a cabinet minister, the Defence Secretary, seemingly, admitting that it's all over?
I mean, that's what it appeared to amount to. I mean, naturally, they've since said that they're, fighting for every vote, as they're obliged to do. But there is an extent to which what he said was, I mean, it is the sort of thing that will be said and will be acknowledged as the campaign goes on. I mean, it's not a formal change in their messaging. Rishi Sunak, will continue to claim that he's seeking majority, but it just looks so difficult for them. And I think that, the issue was that there was in the sort of minds of CCHQ, a coalition to be carved out, composed of, the people who Reform are now aggressively trying to win over pensioners, the over 50s and 60s, and they hope that they could sort of try and unsettle Keir Starmer and poke holes in his record on tax. I will say that has been the one sort of ray of sunlight for them in this campaign. I saw a piece of polling today where people were asked what their main reservations were about Labour, and it was one of those word clouds where you see the concepts which are most salient in people's minds, and that has been tax has risen in salience since those debates, and I think that if Grant Shapps' comments do allude in due course to a realignment of strategy, it is going to be trying to keep that, stem the flow of votes to Labour by basically saying that, good old-fashioned John Major style Labour tax bombshell, that your money's not safe with them.
Well, I think you can argue, if you assume the polls are broadly right, you can argue the best thing for the country is a decent-sized Labour majority where they can actually get stuff done, and a Tory opposition that's not completely reduced to rubble, so they can then hold the government to account. The worst thing after all the recent turmoil and churn would be some sort of hung parliament scenario where you've got a government that can't really get things done without relying on votes from other parties.
I mean, it's not just Grant Shapps. If you look through the adverts that the Conservatives have been buying on Facebook, and you can see those, it is, in recent days, it's been, don't give him a huge majority. If you give him a huge majority, he's going to raise tax. So even the official messaging from the Conservatives are, if you vote for Reform, if you vote for Lib Dems, then you are giving Keir a huge majority. So that is obviously the tactic that they are pushing really hard on social media.
You can tell as well from the seats that they're targeting, they're getting a sort of narrow range of seats. And what I think is also important is that the coalition that Boris Johnson brought together, which included red wall Brexit voters and sort of traditional blue wall Tories, has completely collapsed, and it has collapsed quite some time ago actually, and we're now really seeing that coming to fruition. But meanwhile, on the sort of centre left side, people are coalescing around whoever they're going to vote tactically around whoever can beat the Tories in their seats potentially, and so that's leading to this sort of almost like a double whammy for the Conservative Party. They're squeezed, they're squeezed to the right, they're squeezed to the left. So that's why I think things are looking so difficult for them.
Let's talk about the Conservative manifesto, because obviously tax and the economy is huge in this election, as we know. So £17 billion of tax cuts, including 2p cut in national insurance, funded by clamping down on tax avoidance and welfare reform. The Institute for Fiscal Studies says the latter looks difficult in the extreme. Do you think the figures add up? Richard, do you want to start?
Well, I think we've obviously heard a lot from both of the main parties about taxes. We're not going to raise income tax, we're not going to raise national insurance, we're not going to raise the rate of VAT, although as we well know, we may start adding VAT to some to private school fees. But let's make no mistake about this, taxes are going to rise whoever wins this election. So if you look at the Resolution Foundation, they think that measures already announced will increase the total tax take by about 23 billion a year by 28-29, and it's that old friend fiscal drag which does most of the damage. So by freezing the rates at which the tax bands increase, they drag more and more people into paying tax because they wouldn't have been paying any tax, and drag more and more people into the higher rate of tax. So the IFS say that 4.5 million more people will be in the higher income tax thresholds by 2028. And then both parties have been very quiet on reversing some of those other measures that have already been announced. So the removal of the temporary cuts to business rates, fuel duty and stamp duty, land tax. There are lots of taxes that are due to rise, which you haven't heard the parties talking about. So, obviously tax is a big battleground. It's a difficult area for Labour. It's also a difficult area for the Conservatives because, the tax burden is at the highest since World War II. So there's lots of talk about not raising taxes and tax cuts, but taxes are going to have to go up.
And of course, the flip side of that is spending cuts as well. There's going to be a huge squeeze, whoever gets in after the election. And there's a sort of conspiracy of silence about that, really. So the Institute for Fiscal Studies talk about £18 billion of cuts within the non-protected department. So if you're in the police or the courts, prisons, which are overflowing already, it's hard to see how they square that circle, really, of it's either tax has got to go up, spending has got to be cut, or borrowing has got to rise.
Is there a lack of honesty over that?
There is this, I'm not sure I'd call it a dualism or a tension at the heart of Labour's electoral strategy, which is they want they've changed the mantra, they've tattooed that to Keir Starmer's forehead. That is the number one word of the campaign. But he personifies change in the form of stability. That is their central message. Is on one hand, we represent a break with the past, we represent something new, but the newness and the change is our extreme prudence and erring on the side of caution. And every single last Labour policy has been sandpapered down and whistled down in order to preserve that idea. I mean, the Angela Rayner employment and workers' rights reforms, it started out as this long shopping list of ideas. They're talking about scrapping 0 hours contracts. They're talking about creating a single status of worker, banning people from banning companies from making their workers use phones after work, which obviously wouldn't have much luck over here at the newsroom. But I think that what they then in Party HQ considered was, does this or does it not, number one, help us convey the message that we're going to put money back in people's pockets. They're really focused on this idea of, unless it's about real things that impact people's lives, don't talk about it. And number two, does it open us to does it make us vulnerable to the criticism of unintended consequences and Labour being irresponsible? And so we all know now they're fighting this kind of Ming Vase campaign. The question of what happens on the other side, and you ask whether they're being dishonest, I have to say, I'd be interested to hear what my colleagues think, but I think that the question in Labour land, which is as urgent and profoundly felt at the very top of it as it is among MPs, is what actually is it that Keir Starmer wants to do, and a lot of the people around him just don't know. He does travel light ideologically, and I really don't think that it is the case that they have a pre-written budget or first 100 days. I think that is all. And they don't want you to think this is the case, but I think a lot of it is genuinely up for grabs.
Oliver, do you think they're being honest? Across all parties?
There's a bit of a get out, isn't there, especially on the Labour side, which is growth, and they like to say, well, we're going to get growth up, so that's going to fill some of these holes and solve our problems. It takes time. It's been very sluggish at the moment. And if you look at the levers they're talking about pulling, reforming the planning system, eminently sensible, but it's going to take a long time. Part of the issue there is local authorities have been stripped of budget over the past 15 years. That needs replenishing. How do you do that, given all the constraints we just talked about? You've got possible things like digital IDs coming down the track, but we'll see about that. They can try and sort of say nice things and create a bit more of an atmosphere of positivity around business, which New Labour did to try and attract more private sector investment. But it's not easy to see where it materialises from any time quickly.
I think there's a case actually that they might be more radical in government than we think now, or than they're currently letting on. And obviously in the election campaign they want there to be as small a target as possible on Keir Starmer's back, so that there's no vulnerability, no risk. As Gabriel says, it's the Ming Vase strategy. But just in the areas that I've been looking at, there are some things where could end up being really huge reforms. So, for example, on education, they promised this curriculum and assessment review, including looking at A-levels, GCSEs, the entire school curriculum. That could be massive if they do it to the full extent as the Times Education Commission would like. And similarly on health, when we spoke to Wes Streeting for the Health Commission, he talked about we definitely are going to have to deal with social care if we get in, but we're not going to say that before the election because he doesn't want a sort of, Theresa May dementia tax, Gordon Brown death tax situation. And then on crime, you look at prisons that I mentioned earlier that are completely overflowing. Whoever gets into government is going to have to really think seriously about sentencing policy, really look at who we're sending to prison, can we really afford to send so many people to prison? So in a funny way, I think Keir Starmer might be hiding in plain sight because his missions that he has actually published are hugely ambitious. The problem is there's very little detail on them. But, maybe he is sort of a bit like people said about Trump, take him seriously but not literally, but not seriously. Seriously but not literally.
I mean, they have been, both of the main parties have set out their fiscal rules, so that's a little bit of honesty. But, Rachel's absolutely right. What they haven't done on the other side is set out where the cuts come to meet those fiscal rules. The Labour Party have been honest about VAT and the tax status of private schools, and they've been very firm on that. And they appear to be holding their ground on a quite technical change to the way private equity partners are taxed. So they get a very generous tax break at the moment, and Labour have talked about how that's going to fund some of their spending plans, and despite huge pressure from the industry and sort of threats that they're all going to leave London the day after the election, they're sticking by. I mean, it'll be interesting to see what they say in the coming weeks about capital gains tax. I'm not sure that will be in the first budget, but I wouldn't be surprised to see that at some point in the future. But it does sort of, by ruling out, although they're obviously not going to raise the bands, by actually ruling out changes to all of the big taxes. So when you get that red book after the budget, the things that really make proper numbers, billions rather than hundreds of millions, it does suggest we're going to get some quite fiddly budgets because they're going to have to do the sort of little tweaks here and there. So that tendency, the sort of Brown and particularly Osborne was particularly guilty of it. You remember there would be 30 million of LIBOR funds for a museum, and there'd be this, there'd be, I think
capacity tax.
Yes, exactly. I fear we may have some quite fiddly budgets and a long list of measures in the future.
I want to just say that Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, of course, are doing a leaders' debate at the moment. Rishi Sunak was booed as he arrived at that event, which is worth just pointing out. I just wanted lots of your questions coming in. Thank you so much. Do keep them coming. Just click on the box on your screen. As we were just talking, you mentioned about private school fees there. This is a question that comes up quite a lot, and Richard, I think you've probably got an answer to this. Fazalat says, how likely are Labour to add 20% VAT to private school fees, and if they are applied, how long before they come in and be reversed? Would that even be a thing? Especially since all is going to do is overwhelm the state sector and create an even larger socio-economic gap.
So the Labour Party have been quite clear that they are going to get the OBR to fully look at the finances and look at any measures they're announcing before budget. They don't want to make that same mistake that Liz and Kwasi made. So the earliest they can have a budget after the election would be the beginning of September. So we're not going to see any move until then. I suppose you could see a retrospective, but I'd be very surprised at that. That's sort of that's particularly for on something like VAT, that's probably slightly frowned upon. So it'll be at some point in the future, whether that's the next tax year or from January, who knows.
And the chances politically of ever reversing that, I would have thought, is unlikely.
I'd be surprised.
Even under a Tory government, presumably. I mean, it's just giving money back to what's perceived to be rich people.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit, if we can, about health, because obviously health, economy, it's all kind of linked in together, isn't it? And I wonder, Rachel, health is such a huge issue, and when I'm presenting on Times Radio Breakfast, we are inundated with people whenever Conservatives come on and they say there's going to be tax cuts, and people say, actually, I don't want a tax cut. I want to be able to see a doctor. I want my hip replacement. I want to see a dentist. Do you think that the NHS is being focused on enough so far in this campaign? And I realise we've still got 3 weeks to go. And a Labour manifesto tomorrow.
Yeah, I think it's very near the top of voters' minds. I think everyone has got some kind of personal experience, either them or a family member or a friend, and people really care about it. And there's two sort of interesting things going on, because actually the Conservatives, who you might think would be more reforming about something like the NHS, are absolutely terrified of proposing anything too radical, because Andrew Lansley came in and made a massive muck-up of NHS reform. So their job, as they see it, is to sort of close it down, try not to do anything that's going to scare the voters. Labour's Wes Streeting, on the other hand, absolutely loves rushing around talking about reform. It's not a shrine, it's a service, doesn't mind sort of alienating the unions, really talking about tearing up some of the assumptions about the NHS. So that's quite an interesting dynamic. And the other thing that's interesting in terms of the two main parties is the idea of the nanny state, which Keir Starmer has really embraced, and that's made a very clear dividing line with the Conservatives, apart from with Rishi Sunak on smoking, where he has gone down that route. But the sort of right-wing Conservatives are very anti any kind of obesity measures. They backed away from all of that. And I think you'll see quite a lot in the Labour manifesto about trying to improve public health, which of course, if you want to get the economy, get people back to work, you have to tackle obesity. It's a massive economic problem as well as a massive health problem.
Gabriel, maybe you can answer this question. It's a question which has come in from Sydney, and all of you by all means pick up on it. Does the panel believe that any major party will reform the NHS, or will they just go on throwing increasing amounts of money into a great black hole? I mean, Rachel obviously suggested there Wes Streeting isn't scared of the word of reform.
I think he is quite reforming. I think he will.
What do you think?
I think that Rachel mentioned Andrew Lansley's reforms, and there is this extent to which the political price for the Conservatives of tinkering with the kind of NHS settlement or reorganising it is much higher than it is for Labour, which, having created the NHS, is seen as the natural party of it. Rachel is the expert on Wes Streeting's proposals for the NHS, but I think that I think he is serious about it. I mean, he has the sort of techno utopian thing of Blair. It's not about left or right, it's about past and future, it's about what works. And I do think, there's a huge question mark hovering over the question of social care, but on the NHS, I don't think he is a status quoist, and I don't think he wants to be incrementalist. Labour's going to come. We've already heard that Sue Gray, Keir Starmer's chief of staff, has a whole list of the things that are going to go dramatically wrong within the first few weeks of government. Water companies being nationalised, NHS waiting lists spiking, fuel, cost of living. I mean, they've got all these issues they've identified. I think the question about health is how much legislative and political bandwidth it is that they're prepared to invest. But if we're looking at Wes Streeting's intentions, I think he's very up for instance, partnerships with the private health sector, even just to cut slack in the medium term.
Yeah, I think the Labour Party have the opportunity to reform the NHS that actually it would be really difficult for a Conservative administration to do, because they would just face accusations that they were trying to privatise it, they didn't care about it. Now, whether they seize that opportunity and do reform the NHS is a different question, and I don't know. But I do think, to pick up on Gabriel's point there, you've got to reform social care, and that's a key to making the NHS work. And none of the parties seem to want to talk about that at all, do they?
Yeah, just a very simple point as well. It's at least a 10-year project, isn't it, if not more? And the reason politicians tend not to want to grapple with these kind of huge institutional issues is a year into any new government, they start basically campaigning for re-election and thinking about the short term. And that's why this issue partly comes back to the electoral maths of, whatever size majority Labour get, what sort of state the Tory opposition are in. Do they feel they have the mandate to think about it over longer than just the 5-year electoral time horizon?
Richard, you mentioned the whole thing about social care, and it does feel, obviously, the Liberal Democrats in their manifesto have been absolutely focusing on social care front and centre. But Rachel, it almost feels like Labour and the Conservatives are slightly scared to talk about social care, and I wonder if that comes off the back of the dementia tax and the problems that Theresa May faced.
Yeah, not slightly scared, completely scared, and they're pretty open and honest about that. But that's and it's their own fault because they both politicised it against the other one in the past. You remember those death tax posters with Gordon Brown with the red rose on a sort of gravestone, and then last time, with Theresa May, it was the dementia tax, as you said, Chloe. But they're going to, whoever gets in is never going to fix the NHS without dealing with social care. But you've got 10% of people in hospital fit to go home, but they can't go home because there's no social care for them. So it's a complete nonsense to pretend you can do one without the other. And I think Wes Streeting certainly understands that. Actually, I think Jeremy Hunt understands it too, having been Health Secretary. So they're going to have to confront it. And again, that's going to cost money. So it's another, almost another of these sort of conspiracies of silence, that the politics is getting in the way of the policy.
And there's a question here from Rosemary. Do you think any party will get to grips with upgrading social care, joining equally with the NHS to create a business-like approach and best customer practices throughout the organisation? I mean, do you think there's a chance of that?
So you do have to have much greater integration between the NHS and social care. And I also think there's a lot that you need to give much better sort of support to the workforce. You have to have proper kind of career progression, treat care workers with this same sort of respect that nurses have, which they don't have at the moment. But there's also sort of technology can help here, and I think also with the NHS that if you use data to work out when people are going to be discharged from hospital, there's a pilot in Wales where they managed to reduce their bed blocking numbers by, I think it was 20%, just by using AI to manage the discharge dates and making sure they had social care in place at the right time. There's another company that's using AI to organise the route that care workers take, and they've managed to increase the wages at the same time as reducing the sort of workload. So there are modern solutions to the public services now that weren't there 10 or 20 years ago. That I think, and it's the same with education, that I think Wes Streeting, Peter Kyle is the other really interesting Labour figure to watch on this, who Keir Starmer's told him his task is to rewire Whitehall. And if they do come in with a big mandate, a big majority, that will be, I think, one of the top, first things that they set out to do is really kind of harnessing the power of AI and technology to transform the public services. But they've got to get on with it. You can't sort of, if it's something's going to take 10 years, as Oliver says, you've got to start on day one.
Let's talk about Nigel Farage, because you all mentioned him at the beginning and the huge impact that he's had on the campaign. Do you, to what extent is he shaping this campaign and indeed the result?
He's massively shaping the campaign. I mean, there are some polls that are putting him on, 17, up towards 20% of the vote right now. Some polls, if fulfilled, would put the Conservatives beneath Reform, which is, one doesn't know. We live in high volatility and unpredictable times, but Nigel Farage has played this game before and he's fallen short because
he's stood 7 times, isn't it, and not been elected as an MP personally.
Stood several times, because of the vagaries of first past the post. He's never been returned to the Commons, but he is a singular politician in the influence that he brings to bear on the Conservatives. And the 2014 Euro elections, in which they performed extremely well, that led Cameron to pledge the referendum in part. And I mean, in a way, now I just think it's so difficult for the Conservatives because he is basically just driving a massive wedge within Rishi Sunak's party, and more pertinently, I mean, he's posing questions of Tory MPs themselves. I mean, we were speaking before this panel about Andrea Jenkins, a kind of Conservative MP, Deputy Chairman of the ERG, who has emblazoned Farage's face across her own leaflets. And that is an incredible, vivid illustration of the impact he is having. They want to put him front and centre of what they're saying to voters about what they believe more than Rishi Sunak. And it's tough. I don't know how the Conservatives' long-term reverse out of that ditch, because the things that Farage represents have stalked the party for a very long time.
And I also think it's going to become the defining issue for the Tory leadership that will follow the election, assuming there is a Tory defeat. It'll be the purity test, the new purity test for the Tory right. Will you let Farage in? And candidates will be judged on that basis. If he does win the seat, I expect the most right-wing candidate will win the Tory leadership. I expect they will let Nigel Farage in, and I think it's not impossible that Nigel Farage is leader of the Tory party in the next 2 or 3 years, because as I was speaking to one Tory strategist recently who just said he's nobody's deputy. As soon as whoever is the Tory leader,
as Richard Tice knows.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, if they let him into the party, if they put him on the front bench, he's not going to sit there happily being the number 2. So I think it's about the future of the Tory party as well as this election, actually.
Isn't there a sense of political naivety here that Rishi Sunak called this election early when lots of people didn't expect it? And there was so much chat about how Nigel Farage was not going to stand as an MP because he was going to be heavily invested in the US presidential election. If the election had been called in November, Nigel Farage would have been heavily involved in the US presidential election. There was chat about, signing up to Fox News as a commentator and earning huge amounts of money. Is that just political naivety from Rishi Sunak to not kind of think about that?
What's tough is if you call an early election, you have to have an argument as to why you've done it. And you have to have an argument that goes beyond you can't actually convey to the public that you've done it on the basis of political self-preservation. And there are times where you offer a narrative and it combusts on contact with reality. I mean, Theresa May in 2017 tried to make the election the Brexit election, strengthen my hand in Brussels. The public said, actually, we don't think it's that. We think it is the public services election. And the issue I've just found with Sunak from the beginning is we all know why, well, we think we know why he's done this. His own chief election strategist, Isaac Levido, has let it be known that he didn't want to go this early, but Sunak seems to have felt like things were only going to get worse on small boats crossings and all the rest of it. But he hasn't publicly been able to articulate why it is that he's doing this. And then the only thing then one can dwell on is why he did think he ought to go now. And you're quite right to say he seems to have been very naive on Farage. I mean, Farage will never miss an opportunity to inflict misery and pain and torture on the Tory party, and it's exactly what he's doing now.
You wonder whether Sunak even could have limped through to November with the party holding together. Like, it's so fractious as things are. And just picking up on the other points, you've got 2 fairly technocratic leaders in Starmer and Sunak. You've got a burst of colour in Farage, the kind of tweed flat cap and the pints and all that kind of stuff, and not much to choose between the 2 main parties policy-wise, actually, really. So he's quite potent on that basis.
And also personality-wise, I mean, because if you look at Keir Starmer, he is quite understandably being quite cautious. He doesn't want to do anything that is particularly radical. When you've got such a huge lead in the polls, people could argue, why would you do that? But you've got someone in Rishi Sunak who is seen as very safe and sensible and totally opposite to Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. You've got Keir Starmer being very safe. Nigel Farage is kind of like the rainbow personality within this campaign.
We appear to be nodding in agreement. That's not to say that. I mean,
I don't mean on the politics of it, but I just mean on a purely personality-driven side. He is somebody who is engaging and interesting to look at, whether you agree with his politics or not.
Absolutely. Look at the reaction when he arrived in Clacton on the day after he announced he was standing. It was more like a reception for a boy band than a 50-year-old politician.
On the approach by Labour being very cautious, I mean, Rachel, you know Keir Starmer relatively well, you spent time with him. Is this his personality? Is this what we would see as a Prime Minister, a cautious, safe pair of hands? Or is this a man who is just utterly terrified of losing a poll lead, and then we'll see something different should he become the next Prime Minister?
I think it is partly who he is. So he's a sort of civil servant in a way rather than a politician. He was the DPP. I don't know what the others think, but he was DPP. He's been a public official for many years. He's not a natural kind of swaggering Farage type politician. he's much more comfortable going through, details of policy. I remember following him around for a couple of days when he was doing a sort of NHS tour in Manchester and Liverpool, and he was sort of sitting there. He'd meet groups of staff, and he'd be sitting there with his notebook writing on really quite detailed policy ideas. He really wanted, quite nerdy in a funny way, he wanted to know what they were struggling with, what could make things better, what could he help with if he did get in, and that's a sort of, it's a sign of, it is that sort of slightly civil servicey mentality rather than the grand gesture, I think.
I think that's right. I mean, I think a lot of people do draw a line between, as Rachel just outlined, his career before politics and the way he appears now. I mean, I've spoken to people who knew him during his days at the bar, and I mean, no one says that he was sort of prowling the courtroom like a lion, amazing rhetorical, like broad brushstrokes. I mean, he was a guy who mastered his brief. It wasn't about intellectual flair; it was about rigor, solidity, detail. And I think that was how he approached the CPS as well. I mean, I think, as I understand it, I'm no expert, if you'll forgive me, on the history of the CPS, but I think his big thing was improving standards across the CPS. It was about standardization and fine-tuning the things that led to kind of difference within the prosecutorial community. It wasn't about, blood and tears and appeals to people's emotions. It was, I just want to make things a bit better. And people in Labour land are quite compelled by the idea that might be a reasonable way of selling himself now. We live in difficult times. It's been a difficult period in the life of the country, and he is saying, I am possibly Mr. Fix-It and Mr. in ways that don't terrify you, making things a little better. So I think there is an alignment between his actual personality and the caricature that they've developed for him.
Thank you for all of your questions which are coming in. So many of them. We will get through them. Do keep them coming. Just click on the Q&A, a little button on your screen. They'll come straight through to me here on my iPad, and I'll ask them as we go through this conversation. I just want to ask you, Gabriel, what are you hearing in your conversations with Conservative MPs, Labour MPs? What is the general sense that you're getting about how they are feeling halfway through the campaign?
I mean, I think that it's fair to say that there are probably two feelings within the Tory party. I mean, one is just, wrist-slitting depression, and it's all absolute doom and gloom, and I'm not going to blow anybody's minds in having said that. And then there is an extent to which many of them think that the Tory leadership contest has begun in earnest already. Penny Mordaunt using her debate to accuse Rishi Sunak of having been profoundly and completely wrong on D-Day. Suella Braverman's come out and said that she thinks that Farage ought to be let into the party. People are talking up the prospect of Priti Patel being a candidate. I mean, in some ways, it is, the caravan has already moved on, and they're already in the phony war and thinking about what happens next. I have not spoken to a single Conservative politician, other than, in fact, no, there are no exceptions. They're all equally sober about what's before them.
And in that sense, then, do you get a sense that the Conservative Party, if they are to lose this election, that there will be a move to the right? As Rachel said, maybe even Nigel Farage joining the party, becoming a leader. What does that mean for the One Nation Tories, for the people who are more centrist in the Conservative Party? What does it mean for them?
I mean, I'm quite compelled by the analysis that they are going to go through a kind of IDS phase of lurching to the right to appease their own grassroots, and I'm not sure that anybody would disagree with that now. That is where the energy and momentum is. I mean, I think the more unpredictable thing is what the reality of the PLP, the Parliamentary Labour Party, will look like, and that's actually the much more important question. And there are some people who say, well, if Keir gets a enormous majority, then everybody will be beholden to him, and he'll have the whip hand over a servile parliamentary party. But then there are others who actually say no. In that context, that strengthens. It's a sort of slightly mysterious term that doesn't mean very much, but it sort of holds a truth. The soft left of the Labour Party, not the Corbynistas, not the Blairites, but the sort of centre of gravity in the party. Maybe at that point they say, we've won so hard. Why don't we actually do some more radical things? And I think that will be a really interesting test of where Keir Starmer actually stands on all the questions of reform that we've been talking about.
But also managing that party wherever they sit on the spectrum will also be difficult, because you're going to have, if the polls are right, you're going to have an awful lot of Labour MPs in Parliament who did not expect to be MPs. You know, councillors who stood because that it's their local area and no one else was going to stand. You know, who stood, decided to stand maybe a year ago, 18 months ago, and never expected to actually end up in Parliament. So just managing that, you've seen how difficult some of the SNP MPs found that. It's just going to be fascinating to watch this, very young, intake of MPs who probably didn't expect to be here.
A lot of the Tory MPs talk with horror of Canada '93, which was when basically a centre-right party was destroyed, taken over by a party called Reform, which was a much more right-wing party. And I think they went from several hundred seats, I think it was to 27 in a single election. And they were absolutely annihilated. And there is something really interesting about this, that is it going to be Brexit that ends up destroying the Conservative Party? So they gave the Eurosceptics, David Cameron gave the Eurosceptics a Brexit referendum to try and keep them quiet. Boris Johnson did a deal with Farage to try and keep him quiet. And I always remember Ken Clarke telling me once that the trouble is with the Tory Eurosceptics, that for a Tory leader, they're like crocodiles around the boat, and you give them buns to keep them happy, and then one day you run out of buns, and then they come for you. And that has happened to successive Tory leaders, and it's going to happen to Rishi Sunak if he loses.
I mean, you do wonder, you talked about sort of phony leadership war. I mean, if the polls remain where they are, that has to break out into the open even before polling day, doesn't it? It has to become, if we are still where we are now, at the beginning of that, just you can't imagine that stays under the surface, does it? Does the discipline remain? I don't know.
It's not even really remaining now, is it?
No.
No. So Ella Bravin's no friend of Rishi Sunak's, and he did conspicuously not mention her in his manifesto launch when reflecting on the triumphs of various successive Tory Home Secretaries. But I think the discipline's already pretty. What's the opposite of good? Bad. The discipline is already falling apart, and I do think that
Penny Mordaunt was sent out as the loyalist to sort of defend the government, and she did sort of 3 attacks on.
She headbutted him.
Yeah.
It's astonishing.
Astonishing.
I want to pick up on something you said as well, Richard, about MPs, Labour MPs potentially being elected who never thought they would be. I guess there's also an element here of people are going to be in the cabinet. Labour have been out of power for so long. There's going to be a lot of people, Yvette Cooper aside, Ned Miliband, but people who have got no government experience. And I just wonder, there's the political element of that. But from a business perspective, how does the business world, do they worry about that there's potentially going to be a cabinet full of hugely inexperienced politicians?
Well, businesses have been working very hard to get close to the MPs who they suspect will be in the cabinet, and particularly those that will be in areas that they're concerned and interested in. So I think they've got quite a good relationship. They feel they're listened to. They know the sort of senior shadow cabinet who we suspect the position. I mean, I think business are just quite looking forward to a bit of stability. I'm not sure that they are still worried about various commitments. So I know the workers' reforms have been watered down, but they're still of concern. Some businesses, Oliver will be able to give a view on that as well, and they're definitely concerned about the repeal of some of the strike legislation. So they're getting, obviously, because they can read the polls just like us, they're getting very close to Labour. Whether they're supporting Labour is a different question, and I do think they still have some concerns. And there are things they really like. They love the idea, particularly house builders, and of the idea that we're actually going to finally get to grips with planning in this country. But I think they do still have some concerns. But I think those are about policies rather than individuals.
Yeah, that's right, isn't it? I mean, there are concerns. There's the inexperience of many of the Labour team. Things like the workers' rights package, which is many see as a sop to the unions. You've also got prospect post-election, a load of unions banging on the door of a Labour government saying, right, now it's payback time, give us a load of stuff we want. But I agree with Richard, stability is the watchword, and I'm plagiarising David Smith, our economics editor here, but CEOs don't object to Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt. In fact, they quite appreciate the stabilising work they've done post the Trussonomics mini budget. They're well regarded as a couple of guys. They're sort of dynamic, thoughtful in the way they engage. But what they don't love at all is the Tory party and the Tory membership, which chose Liz Truss over Rishi Sunak. And they've seen since 2016, really, most things have been done for the purpose of internal party management rather than what's best for the country, the investment climate, the economy. And they really want to end that churn of ministers, 13 housing ministers, 7, I think, chancellors, 6 or 7 business secretaries. They just want to end that drama, histrionics.
But I mean, Labour have been working really hard to woo business, haven't they? I mean, I remember it wasn't that long ago when, at the Labour conference, you wouldn't see any businesses. Last year, they were tripping over each other to get there, weren't they? I mean, they've worked hard.
They've worked hard, and it's chicken and egg, isn't it? Because business CEOs will go where the power's going to go, so they can read the polls like everyone else, and it's partly them gravitating towards the sunflowers turn to face the sun. Some of it is Labour's work. I think there are probably some more U-turns to come, by the way. Things like the carried interest crackdown, the clamp down on the way a lot of private equity guys make their money. If you look at what Labour are talking about in terms of the green economy, building a load of renewables, solar, wind, that's going to need investment from the likes of Blackstone, Brookfield, big private equity players. I think you're going to see some more watering down of what they promised around some of those slightly anti-business measures.
And that's particularly who they've been caught in. So, it kind of gets lost in the kind of whole idea that's just sort of smoked, scrambled egg circuit. But they have been particularly focused on those big investors, particularly the big US investors, that those and the big UK investors like Legal & General and Aviva. Those are the people they've really been targeting because they are desperate for growth, as we know, and they do believe that they can persuade people to invest in the UK.
Before we get through lots of the questions which are coming in, we should mention Scotland, Gabriel. And of course, I mean, it's just when you thought, nothing more mad could happen in this campaign, Douglas Ross decides that he's not going to be Conservative leader after the election. I mean, we mustn't forget the importance of Scotland in this election.
Not at all. And I'll tell you one person who hasn't, that is Keir Starmer. One of the very first things that his chief strategist, Morgan McSweeney, did was oversee the decapitation of the Scottish Labour leader Richard Leonard. It was absolutely foundational to Keir Starmer's vision for how he would piece together a majority that Labour would be redeemed north of the border as the preeminent unionist party. And the Hamilton and Rutherglen by-election was a massive moment for them in that they're a bit queasy about it south of the border. They were bombing bombing voters with leaflets about Angela Rayner's workers' rights reforms. They're trying to outflank or outmaneuver the SNP by saying, independence is no longer on the table, and we are actually a party that are going to do radical and substantial things to affect the cost of living crisis. But it is so important to them, and I'm guilty as anybody else, but we don't talk about it enough in terms of the big things that have changed over the course of this parliament. It is that Labour, after a decade of being locked out of power in Scotland, looks again like a player. And obviously the self-sabotage of the Tory party and the woes of the SNP have created a perfect storm. But it's again, that's the sort of been the theme of Keir Starmer's leadership generally, but his whole thrust has been, I need to be in a position to exploit that, and that's what he tried to do with Anas Sarwar, and it is bearing fruit.
He's a sort of really interesting, sort of lucky leader, isn't he? Lucky general, but he's also then capitalised on that luck in different ways.
Yeah.
Oliver, you've written a great piece in the Sunday Times recently, speaking to Tony Blair, and lots of people are making the comparison, aren't they, between 1997 and Tony Blair's landslide and what we're going to see potentially on July the 4th. Give us your reflections on that.
Again, I'm plagiarising someone else, but it's been pointed out that Starmer's made a kind of sense of man journey from Corbyn light to working with Gordon Brown on constitutional reform to listening to Tony Blair more and appearing with him on stage at his TBI event last year. I mean, there's plenty of Blairites in the team, aren't there? People like Pat McFadden, old Blair cabinet minister. And if you look at a lot of what TBI has put out, very thoughtful, detailed stuff on things like planning reform, how you can shorten the process, reduce the scope for appeals, take out some of the gum that sticks up the planning process. That's the kind of stuff Labour are talking about. So you can see the fingerprints of Blair in many of those ideas.
Lots of your questions coming in. We've only got 12 minutes left, so we better get through more of these questions because, I want to get through as many as we can. This has come in here from Jan Good. Do you see Reform UK replacing the Conservatives as the right-wing opposition to Labour?
I think it might be more of a reverse takeover. So Farage and co go into the Tory party and become the Tory party.
Yeah, I agree with Rachel on that. I've actually had a bet on Farage to be the next leader of the Conservative Party.
Oh, have you?
I'd never follow my bets. They're terrible. but I think a reverse takeover. It feels more than. But who knows? I mean, we'll have to wait and see. But yeah, it feels like a reverse takeover would be the way that would go.
How much do you stand to gain?
Would you be enriched by Nigel's success?
No, I will not be enriched. It's a very small bet.
Gabriel, what do you think?
I've got nothing to add. I think it's entirely reverse takeover, and whether it is formally the case that he becomes leader or that he becomes the main right-wing party, he is currently dictating the conversation in the Tory party.
As he has for over a decade, actually. Fascinating.
And you must remember there is this battle within the Conservative Party. Peter Cruddas back in this democratic organisation within the Tory Party that's still incredibly angry about Boris Johnson's departure, about the way Rishi was, took over. So there is, I think, a big battle to come in terms of, perhaps in the future how the Tory party selects their leader. You could see the grassroots push for a bigger voice. Yeah, I
mean, the one thing we've not actually raised at all in this conversation is the B word. I mean, the only thing that could temper Farage's comeback is, I don't want to talk him up. There are lots of things that could happen. But Boris, and he, we all know, has been licking his wounds. He's not going to play a role in this campaign. I think he was holidaying in the Mediterranean somewhere when I last spoke to a member of his team, but he is, by all accounts, not done with politics, and he's currently on book duty writing his memoir. But he obviously thinks there's another chapter, and he's probably the only person, as we know from 2016, who can reach those parts of the electorate and excite the Tory base in that way.
Can you imagine a leadership contest between Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson?
That is a fascinating question.
You'd watch that, wouldn't you? One tiny PS is that grassroots, after the UKIP, the Tory party absorbed a lot of those members, didn't it? And the Tory grassroots base is quite UKIP-y and quite Farage friendly, so they are his people.
And also Boris Johnson purged a lot of the centrist MPs, certainly, and along with them quite a lot of members left at the same time.
Yeah.
Joe Cousins has got in touch asking, Paul Brown this morning asked Rishi Sunak if he's too rich to be relatable. Does the panel feel this is true and relevant to his position?
I don't think it's actually true that it needs to be so, but I think he has allowed himself to be defined. I mean, he is wealthy. We know from the Sunday Times Rich List that he is wealthier than the king, but he has an unusual and in many ways extraordinary story, and I think he's the least fleet-footed Prime Minister. It is difficult to comprehend the way in which he has allowed himself to be characterised in this way. You hear him repeat that his mother was a pharmacist and his dad was a GP, and I don't want to be cynical about that, and it's, he's not Boris Johnson. He might be an old Wickhamist, but he's not the same as Tory leaders past in that regard. But he is he's been put in a vice by Labour, and he's just never managed to get himself out of it. And it is one of those things where, the early controversy about his wife's non-dom tax status and Labour's relentless attacks on sleaze and their failure to properly reform the non-dom agenda. I mean, he has just been so unable to transcend that, and it's become a fatal political problem. And it's one of those things. I think Rachel was saying beforehand that there are these campaigns where sort of events come to rhyme with expectations, and you're looking for them to make the gaffe. You're looking for them to say something that echoes the existing narrative, and that is just his problem now. He's said this thing about how when he was young he couldn't afford Sky News, and it just becomes parody-like. Whereas if Keir did the equivalent thing, I just don't think there's an appetite publicly to sort of put rocket boosters underneath it in the same way.
Gabriel mentioned Boris Johnson. He was Eton, Oxford, Central London, affluent guy by most people's standards, but he has that political nous, doesn't he? That ability to connect, which is quite rare, and you can walk into a working class town centre and get applauded. It's a question of political antennae, isn't it, and political savviness, which Sunak just doesn't have.
Boris Johnson is actually deeply, despite that material privilege, he's a deeply damaged person. But his mother went into a mental institution when he was, I think, 10, and she said that's the moment at which he decided he wanted to become world king, to protect himself from this kind of dangerous world and the pain of that separation. So, and that's why, you know, he's got a sort of really deep yearning for public affirmation, which maybe Sunak's too happy, maybe Sunak's too normal. You know, Starmer has equally actually had pretty tough childhood, and I think there is something about politicians who have to connect with the voters at a very visceral, profound level that makes them cut through. I'm not quite sure where Nigel Farage fits into this, but
with that question this morning, which Rishi Sunak was asked, surely somebody in government thought he might be asked that question. Is that not the question you'd practice an answer to?
It's like the one about the cost of the pint of milk, isn't it?
You know it's going to come in the campaign. Surely someone's going to say you're rich, you're privileged, you're not relatable. And he seemed quite shocked by that question and unprepared.
I think that there is always one question which, you know, unpicks that lock and exposes a politician, and if it's not the price of milk, then it is. You know, I mean, it's such a difficult question because he was, you know, Paul Brand being the formidable interviewer that he was. I mean, he wasn't letting go of the ball. I mean, he absolutely forced him to outline something that he had struggled with, and I mean, it's tough. I mean, you know,
but he could have said, couldn't he? You know, my parents gave up a lot to send me to private school. I don't know what they went without. Maybe they went without, but they protected me from that. I mean, there's ways to sort of get round that, you would have thought. Anyway, let's get through some more questions. Brian Billingham says, what can be done to mend our broken politics, particularly given the increasing tendency for politicians to lie and intentionally misinform the electorate? Nothing.
That's a big question.
I think it's actually a really important question for whoever, you know, if it is Keir Starmer after the election, when he stands on the steps of Number 10, you know, multiple prime ministers have stood on the steps of Number 10 promising a new dawn, a new form of politics to restore trust. But I think it's really got to happen now, and there's got to be a bit more honesty about some of the tough decisions. And it's a really interesting test about once this sort of Ming Bar's moment is over, would he be able to do that?
I think it is absolutely. I mean, the difficulty for successive Tory prime ministers is they've either made promises which have been difficult to actualise, or they've just not had the parliamentary arithmetic on their side. So the rhetoric has never quite been fulfilled by reality. I think the big thing you talk was it Brian who asked about fixing politics. I think that if Keir Starmer does inherit a, you know, 3-figure majority, he has to use that to reassure public faith in democracy. I mean, we've just had these European elections. We can be insular. I mean, you look at the US, you look at Europe. It's no small thing to be a progressive politician with a big majority like that, and I would fear. I mean, obviously, that, you know, it's sort of democracy itself is on the ballot paper in a lot of countries at the moment, and there's some big issues he's got to deal with: migration, the economy, health. It's not an enviable intro, but he's actually the only politician in some time who might have a decent stab at dealing with it, notwithstanding the 80-seat majority that Johnson had, which we were saying has since been reduced to, was it 42?
47, I thought you said.
47.
Do politicians think that the electorate can't cope with the truth, can't be honest? Do they worry that if they are honest, that actually they'll then be punished by voters and not voted in?
Look, I think that the main thing is, what is the essay question that is being asked of politicians at the moment? It's not to tell the country home truths and difficult things, it's to win. So they are naturally, I'm afraid, Brian, not going to tell you the things that you don't want to hear, and they're not going to burden you with information about all the difficult things that you're going to have to stomach in the event of a Labour or Tory victory. I think that's more just sort of foundational to the way the elections work.
Okay, we've only got a couple of minutes left, and I'd like you all to answer this if you would. Nick Wells asks, if this discussion is held in a year's time, what will we be talking about? Which I think is a great question.
Well, I took the first question. I think it's appropriate that I hand it over to my
Rich is
colleague.
looking keen.
I think we'll be talking about the the second budget, because I think we'll obviously get a budget in September, and then, you know, all chancellors say they only want to have one budget a year, and then all chancellors have 2 budgets a year, which is great for business editors. So I think we'll probably be here talking about the second budget and the measures they've enacted, and I think we'll have a much better idea from that about what sort of government, whichever is elected, what sort of government they're going to be?
I think things are going to get hard for Labour very quickly. Expectations have been built up, haven't they? And people have been very tired of the last few years of turmoil. You're going to have unions, I think, pushing for various things that Labour can't give them. You're going to have Labour having to U-turn on a load of policies already, including things like the carried interest and maybe even the private school fees VAT. I wouldn't be surprised. Sluggish economy and a load of fiscal pressures around debt, spending, taxes, and it's going to be a really horrible puzzle to try and solve.
Good, thanks Oliver, that's made us feel happy. Rachel.
I fear we're going to be talking about the cost of living crisis, small boats, crumbling hospitals, waiting lists. These are all really difficult, teacher recruitment crisis, prisons. These are all really, really difficult things, and they're not going to be solved in 9 months, 12 months, whatever it is, from September when a new government really gets going. So that's slightly depressing thought as well.
Gabriel?
I'm going to break with journalistic habit and say, I don't know.
Gosh, bit of honesty. That's what we like. Well, listen, thank you so much. I can't believe an hour has gone past so fast. So thank you so much for joining us. I really hope that you have enjoyed it. Thank you so much for your questions. So many more that we didn't have a chance to get through. Now, this is just the first of our weekly live streams in the run-up to the election on July the 4th. There'll be another one at the same time next Wednesday, the 19th of June, and again on the 26th of June. But if you are a Times Plus subscriber, good news, you can enter a ballot to actually come to an in-person event here at the News Building at London Bridge. That's being held on the 2nd of July. All of the details will be in the Times Plus newsletter this weekend, so keep an eye out for that. Hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks for your company and good night.